Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to all. My name is Sultan Al-Ali. I'm a resident fellow and deputy head of scientific research affairs at Trends Research and Advisory. On behalf of Trends Research and Advisory and Dr. Muhammad Al-Ali, the CEO of Trends, I would like to welcome all of the distinguished speakers along with our online attendees to our E-Symposium entitled Strategies for Sustainable Security in the Next 50 Years. In today's session, we seek to address several themes, such as what will security threats look like in the coming 5 decades? How will major powers confront these future security challenges? What particular strategies and policies can help to ensure a more sustainable security environment? These are but some of the topics we hope to cover and have our expert panelists touch on. Allow me to make an important announcement before we start. Please take note that Trends will broadcasting this event on our YouTube channel and provide an English language version as well as an Arabic version translated of this event live. Now, let me turn this over to our moderator for today's event, Dr. Stephen Blackwell, who is the scientific advisor and director for strategic studies at Trends. Dr. Stephen, the floor is yours.
Glad you've been able to join us this afternoon. Today we are covering about the broadest topic one can conceive of, strategies for sustainable security in the next 50 years. Of course, many aspects, many dimensions to this issue. And fortunately, we have a very distinguished panel of guests, speakers joining us today. So because of time constraints, I'm not going to waste too long on the introduction, and I'd like to go straight to our first speaker, Mr. Steve Safaro, who is the chairman of the Public Safety Working Group of the Security Industry Association in the United States of America. And he will be speaking on security threat sources and how the map, as it were, might change over the next 50 years. So, Mr. Safaro, if you could go ahead, please. I want to ask all our speakers if they can stick to around 10 minutes, but please, Mr. Safaro, the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to be with you folks on this. And I have visited every one of the countries that I'm going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about some of the technologies, the practice areas in security. Obviously, when you talk about security, probably the first thing that you think about is cyber. But a lot of the practice areas include utilities, food and water, risk management, and public safety. And having been to Dubai several times and Abu Dhabi, it is such a refreshing change to see public safety in motion and a very, very high adoption of influencers like artificial intelligence, as well as ICT, IoT, smart city solutions. And then obviously I have to return to the United States, which is reality. And we're seeing quite a change in our environment. So we have a very strong cyber resilience, but actually in the areas of AI and biometrics, although we have high competence, we have very low adoption. So it's a very significant difference. And it's important when you're considering threats to understand this difference. And also, obviously, from the threat landscape, we'll talk about China and Russia having a very strong cyber practice area and a commitment to AI, but a very high competence in other areas like cyber attacks. So we've seen that in the past as well. So with regard to the UAE, a way that I really am so happy that I see is the National Program for Artificial Intelligence is going to help us meet the threat of every one of these different cyber threats because of the focus on AI. And it's really incredible that we have in the UAE a Learn AI platform and continuous public safety deployments using robotics, which leverage AI. And these different solutions are very hardened. And it's important to understand that a lot of other countries are looking at the UAE, are looking at the United States, looking at Singapore, looking at China, of course, and are looking to develop on their own. So one of the things I didn't mention that I think is absolutely fantastic, the UAE is even using unmanned aerial surveillance to seed clouds for weather changes. That's obviously an incredible opportunity for cyber attacks, but the hardening of those platforms is very important because they're very much industrial platforms rather than consumer technology. Russia and China are very much encouraging AI, but at the same time, they're seeding cyber threats. And I'll jump right to the different threat actors we've seen in the past. Goldmax, Goldfinder, persistent DNS tunneling. Essentially, what Russia and China are doing in a lot of cases is fooling a lot of these expert solutions to thinking that they're a trusted person or a trusted entity on the internet. And this is so significant to understand. And one of the interesting aspects, I spoke to an FBI asset as a result of the Colonial Pipeline compromise. And you wouldn't guess the first thing that the ransomware checked was the country that they were attacking. And it's interesting, Russia, for some reason, allows you to attack any country except for the one that you are originating at. So it checks first to see that you're not from Russia. So Occam's razor applies in a lot of these cases. So sometimes the simplest threat landscape is the way to defeat it. The NCPI, which is a excellent measurement of cyber security prowess. And the link is on here if you want to download my presentation. But again, in China, we are seeing a number of advanced persistent threats. APT41, Air India was attacked. MS Exchange server was attacked. But in a lot of these cases, again, they are sophisticated, but not extremely sophisticated. Everyone that's on this call is representing a country that is far better than that. But we have to be very concerned about that in these cases. So the US has an extreme focus on meeting cybersecurity competence and AI development. However, we have in the United States a very low adoption of non-consumer solutions for AI. So believe it or not, in the security industry, we use AI much less than in consumer electronics. And one thing I want you to be aware of is that many of the consumer electronics, when you add a feature, let's say onto an iPhone, these consumer electronics, sometimes the iOS allows enhancements that actually allow for incredible cyber vulnerabilities. One of the latest enhancements to iPhone iOS is actually to scan every picture and to digitize it. So what essentially happens in your iCloud, if your iCloud is hacked, and a lot of people scan paper of their passwords are now automatically hacked. So the information environment is being controlled and manipulated both by good powers and by bad actors. So it's important to have the foreign intelligence collection from a national security standpoint. And you're seeing those 7 steps that the United States goes through for cyber resilience. However, we're very much not focused on a lot of the electronic security, especially we're not even just getting refocused on vehicular attacks. And this is going to happen more and more in the future. So what I'm going to show you here is just a 50-year map to conclude on this. And since we were talking about 50 years in the future, we're talking about 50 years of advancements. And we're going to be seeing, like, let's say in about another few years, automatic driver assistance systems are going to take the next leap. Unmanned aerial surveillance drones are going to be autonomous, and cyber warfare coalitions are going to exist. So it's no accident that this is August 31st, and my prayers go out to a lot of folks that are over in Afghanistan. But one thing that we have to realize is that a lot of different terrorist entities are now going to be well-funded by drug cartels, et cetera. So there may be coalitions in the future. Smart cities are going to be very, very important, and V2X is going to be an incredible opportunity for cyber attacks. So that must be hardened. 3D object recognition is going to happen. And what's going to be interesting in the future in about 10 years are these smart, if you've heard of smart dust, these are the first virtual or perpetual computing machines. In other words, computers that don't require power, that are self-powered. And the antithesis of smart dust are evil dust. And imagine if evil dust carried cyber warfare. You could get that in the middle of a computer, it could bind itself to a system on a chip, which, by the way, can anybody think of the #1 country that most of our system on chips are manufactured? And it is China. Even countries that are like Sweden, the United States, these are all manufactured by what we call electronic service manufacturers and electronic manufacturer services, which take the designs and actually deploy it. So we're very much concerned about some of the Asian counterparts in 5G environments, but we choose not to look at where virtually all of our silicon is being manufactured. Way in the future, the internet will actually, URLs will cease to exist. And I want you to be aware that more peer-to-peer communications will result. And obviously, we're seeing a great deal of satellites deployed. And we don't know exactly when satellite weapons will occur. And these may have as their targets things like hyperloops. Hyperloops are expected to begin in their intra-continental in different countries. Elon Musk is a very big fan of hyperloops, and as well as Virgin Atlantic. But I believe these hyperloops are going to represent a tremendous target for cyber warfare. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our esteemed panel, and I want to thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting, very pertinent presentation. I'll move straight on to our next speaker, Dr. Syed Muhammad Ali, who is joining us from the United States of America. And Dr. Ali is adjunct professor at the Johns Hopkins University, non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute, and a columnist for the Express Tribune. So, Dr. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So my focus is going to be implicit in it are cyber issues, but I want to take a broader view, a regional view, and think of sustainable security in South Asia. And in that regard, South Asia is, of course, it's a very populous region with a quarter of the globe's population. It's a region of immense untapped possibilities because there's so much trade and economic potential in the area. Yet it's also plagued by conventional and human security challenges, right? So by human security, one means the impact of tenuous security environments on human beings, right? So it's that human-centric approach to security. So if one looks at from malnutrition to mother and child health to to famines to droughts, and then it's a loop where human security can exacerbate conventional security and vice versa, right? As we've been seeing in Afghanistan, the failure to deliver human security and the outcomes that it produces. So looking at South Asia, one has to think, a bit deeper, not archaeological deep time, but, at least 70 years or so in the past, at the very least. I mean, the history of conquest is of course, much more convoluted, in this region, with sort of, going back all the way to, incursions by Muhammad bin Qasim, in the 7th century when Islam came to South Asia, and even earlier Hinduism. But if we stop the buck at colonialism and the colonial encounter and colonial policies of divide and rule, right, and the hurried way in which sort of the British exited the region, leaving many unfinished agendas, right, like Kashmir, the Kashmir dispute, right, leading to a lot of sort of contentions within nation states, newly formed nation states. I mean, Bangladesh, the tragic birth of Bangladesh out of Pakistan, out of East and West Pakistan in 1971, and the carnage surrounding the very partition of the Indian subcontinent. Right, and we can think similarly in terms of ethnic tensions within Sri Lanka, which then gave rise to the LTTE, and that bloody civil war. So there's been, there's this kind of colonial legacy of partition created the conditions, the preconditions for this kind of tension in the region. And it's not only, a colonial legacy. We're not only thinking about 70 years in the past and blaming everything, that we see in South Asia today on that past. It's also, geopolitics. And if we cut, if we don't focus on the Cold War, but the subsequent period, which I'll, post 9/11, we can think of it as GWOT, the global war on terror. Right. And now this emerging, if we're thinking next 50 years, this emerging great power competition between the US and China. Right. And what that's doing to the regional insecurities. Right. And rather than alleviating them, at least at the moment, it is exacerbating them. Right. So as a result, South Asia is experiencing, is undergoing these sort of, the broader global dynamics of great power competition. And simultaneously, it's got the regional and the domestic challenges. And the add-on is the threat multiplier, right? So, I mean, the US Department of Defense, for instance, and many others in scholarship now talk about climate change as a threat multiplier, where where there are existing tensions, it worsens them. Right. So my argument at the end would be that essentially one needs to think of a human-centric approach to regional security, right, in the long run, which is the only sustainable way of thinking about security in the region. Now, to just illustrate my point about the impact of the global war on terror, the global war on terror has fueled regional tensions between states. I mean, think of Afghanistan and Pakistan and the tensions within them, and then the tensions between Pakistan and the US because of the 20-year intervention and the dismal results it produces, right? Finger pointing, etc. It creates tensions, internally as well, and it creates proxy tensions. So India thinking and Pakistan pointing fingers at India and vice versa over Afghanistan and what's happening in Afghanistan, and internal discontent. And in the case of internal discontent, I mean, if you recall the Rajapaksa brothers, the strongman tactics that they used to brutally crush the LTTE, about 10, 12 years ago, where there were human rights violations, they were using human shields. I mean, originally it had come out of Tamil disgruntlement in Sri Lanka, and the state was, used a very strong arm tactic, and there wasn't reconciliation and compromise, and we saw bloody civil war with use of female suicide bombers and Colombo in lockdown and all of that. But the way that the Rajapaksa brothers, who've come back to power now in Sri Lanka, the way that they crushed them, they framed that issue, as the LTTE not being freedom fighters but being terrorists. Right? It's the same language that India uses in Kashmir to deflect from its own human rights record. Right? So it's provided a convenient framing, right, to quash internal discontent. And it's also then exploited, this idea is exploited by regional rivals, right? So in the case of, for instance, I mean, we often hear about India complaining about Pakistan's use of militant proxies, but Pakistan also complains of, the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, being funded and used by India to create, to target Chinese infrastructure projects in the rest of province of Balochistan, for instance. So this is the impact of the global war on terror, right? Like the last 20 years. Now, looking forward at great power competition, we see that it's going to have some long-term impacts. I mean, it's the way in which the US has been rolling out the red carpet treatment to India. It's creating insecurities within Pakistan. And even with the new administration, we don't see so far, the US managing its relationship with India and Pakistan in a way that, that is perceived as being balanced. So just wanting to use India as a counterpart to China, right, and is creating and sustaining this protracted rivalry within the region. There's now, I mean, in the past, when push came to shove and there was a threat of nuclear conflict, the US would help mediate, and China, because it was its neighborhood, would mediate the Indo-Pak skirmishes, right, away from the point of no return. And there might be diminishing capacity to do that if the great power competition continues heating up, right? And then there's also this idea of this kind of strategic chain. China looks at the US, India looks at China, and Pakistan looks at India, and there's this ongoing conventional buildup as well as nuclear, a nuclear arms race, which is heating up for the foreseeable future. And now for climate, added onto all of this in this populous region is the glacial melt in the Hindu Kush, in the Himalayan ranges, in the Karakoram ranges. And, this affects the waters of upper and creates tensions between upper and lower riparian states. I mean, all that water coming from China, flowing through India, then, going through the Brahmaputra and the Ganges, being shared by Bangladesh and India, being shared, the Indus being shared between Pakistan and India. Now, if there's lesser water coming in, and Pakistan is an agricultural country entirely dependent on the Indus, and there are tensions there, right? That the existing treaty between them is not an ecological treaty. It just bifurcates the river, right? And it's not going to be able to withstand the pressure of climate change. Afghanistan has no water sharing treaty with any of its neighboring states. No, attempt was made over the past 20 years to put in place. It's hard doing so, creating one with I mean, with Iran, there was something there but was never operationalized, right? So these are the challenges that are going to become increasingly problematic. And we could see climate-induced migrations now from Bangladesh when they come into Indian Assam, where there's already an insurgency. It's going to worsen that insurgency because that insurgency was triggered by the fear of the Bengali influx, cross-border influx. Similarly, Pakistan is facing this, you're preemptively, dreading this new wave of Afghan refugees. There are still about 2 or 3 million Afghans in Pakistan, right? When it comes to air pollution, every year now in Pakistan, in Lahore, the city I'm from, we have a 5th season, which is called smog season. And there's finger pointing. Oh, it's the crop burning in India. This is, which is doing this. There's no data sharing over this stuff. So what needs to happen, and of course, one can't, get into greater depth here, but what we need in the region is thinking of security from a human-centric lens. I mean, globally, regionally, and nationally, right? Where there are opportunities to address human security rather than just beefing up conventional security. I mean, environmental diplomacy is an example, right? Where shared resources like water and estuaries, etc., there can be data sharing and cooperation on. And there's international precedent for this too. I'm not pulling this out of La La Land. I mean, there is concrete ways in which one can actually go about doing this. And even at the geostrategic level, we don't see this kind of cooperation. We still see this kind of zero-sum game. I mean, now China posturing to, invest in Afghanistan now that there's been a disgraceful American exit. And, then the US thinking of that as a zero-sum game. I mean, the way that they've been describing the BRI, the Belt and Road, and Pakistan, like, going over to China and thinking of that as predatory lending. So World Bank, IMF, USAID is not predatory lending. It's not the carrot and stick approach, but China's lending is, right? So there are ways where, and the precedents in the past, I mean, Pakistan served as, created rapprochement during the Nixon, Nixon era with Kissinger. So Pakistan at least could be, and it wants to be, a space where the US and China can cooperate. Now, will this happen? Seems unlikely given the current posture, right? There's also a possibility, lastly, of, creating reconstruction opportunity zones like the US has done.
Dr. Ali, if I could ask you to just sort of bring it to a conclusion, please.
Last point. I know I'm
Thank
running.
you very much.
Last point. My last point is that, the US had been talking about the need for a reconstruction opportunity zone straddling the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, which would provide preferential trade access to American markets. And they've done something like this in Israel and Egypt, which works quite well. But it hasn't happened in the case of Afghanistan, and that's what's needed for economic stabilization and Afghanistan not being aid dependent. But these are the human-centric, strategies for stabilization that are not getting the attention that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Much food for thought there, lots to discuss. I'll very quickly move on to our next speaker, as Mr. Fabian Bloomberg, who is a regional representative to the Gulf states with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Germany. So Fabian, please, if you would like to take the floor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. And first of all, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the colleagues at the Trends Research and Advisory, especially you, Stephen, but also Christian, but the whole team for setting up this event, and also for giving me the opportunity to give a few views or ideas on the topic of the future of regional security with a focus on the Arabian Gulf. The security of the Arabian Gulf is a topic that scholars, experts, and politicians from within the region and from outside of it are discussing since the discovery of oil in the region several decades ago. However, the challenges to the Arabian Gulf security have changed over time. So during the Cold War, there have been fears that the Eastern Bloc will try to destabilize the region in order to have access to its resources and to threaten the West by preventing the oil supplies to its shores. During this era, we have witnessed Iran-Iraq 8 years war. There were fears that the war might spill over to all the region, threatening the oil supply to the world's economy. More importantly, then, there was fear that the new Islamic regime in Iran will try to export its version of Islam to neighboring countries, either by encouraging and supporting Islamic revolutions or by direct invasion to its neighbors. And in the early 1990s, it was not Iran the major threat to the Arabian Gulf security, but Iraq under Saddam Hussein's regime. He occupied Kuwait and threatened at the same time to occupy the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the remaining Gulf states. So Kuwait was liberated and the threat to the Arabian Gulf was removed when the coalition troops under the leadership of the United States forced Saddam's regime to move out of Kuwait and imposed severe sanctions on it. So the threat of Saddam's regime to its neighbors was contained, but the invasion of the American troops to Iraq in 2003 and the 2011 uprisings unleashed new threats to the Arabian Gulf states. So Iran, which was contained in its borders and has only access to Hezbollah in Lebanon, gained access after that to Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. This access to Arab countries, coupled with its nuclear and ballistic missiles program, created a security dilemma for the Arabian Gulf states. And to complicate the issue furthermore, the United States' commitment to the Arabian Gulf security is no more solid as before. The US changing interests and priorities are affecting directly the Arabian Gulf. So the US is currently redeploying its troops in and outside the region in order to be in a better position to encounter China. And the Americans, whether Democrats or Republicans, reached the conclusion that a new war in the region would only exhaust their resources and won't fix the Arabian Gulf's security. And so the difference between the two parties is that the Democrats believe a return to the nuclear deal with Iran and integrating Iran in the region is the right approach to the Gulf states' security, while the Republicans believe a maximum pressure policy, for example, economic sanctions, may force Iran to change its behavior in the region. When it comes to Europe, in Europe, there is disagreement with the policy of the maximum pressure on Iran. It has been tried before and failed, and it has put the region on the brink of a devastating war. So here there is a big belief that a return to the nuclear deal and integrating Iran in a new security arrangement in the region is in the best interest of all parties in the region and in the interest of Europe. And against this backdrop, the Americans under Biden's administration and the Europeans are in favor for a new security architecture in the Arabian Gulf that is based on 3 pillars. All states should respect the sovereignty and integrity of each other, and they should not meddle in the affairs of one another. All conflicts in the Arabian Gulf should be solved through dialogue and peaceful negotiation. And finally, all states in the Gulf region should enjoy security. So the basic assumption here is that no state in the Gulf region can enjoy security if other states in the same region do not enjoy it as well. To put simple, if Iran goes nuclear, the Arabian Gulf states will go nuclear. And if Iran continues to develop its missiles program, the Arab Gulf states will continue to seek sophisticated weapons, and as a result, no one will enjoy security. So we do not know how the Gulf states and Iran can arrive to a new security arrangement that ensures their security in the future, but I think we can take some lessons that we learned in Europe. So during the last century, Europe was destroyed twice in the First and the Second World War. Tens of millions were killed and complete cities were wiped out. So we learned it the hard way that we need to communicate to build on what bonds us together rather than on what divides us, and to build institutions in order to coordinate our policies and to fix the problems between us. So today it's hard to imagine that two European countries are in a state of war with each other, because we have created institutions that can resolve conflicts within Europe before they erupt and develop. And we speak in Europe today about a security community in which, of course, bilateral disagreements happen to be, but where interstate problems are solved peacefully and where we are at the end united against external threats. So we are not a bloc against any competing power, but we defend ourselves collectively. So maybe the Arabian Gulf states and Iran can learn from this experience. We believe the first condition to arrive to a new security architecture where all states in the region can enjoy collective security is to build regional institutions. Through those institutions, all the conflicts in the Arab region, such as those in Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, can be discussed and solved. And it is striking to us in Europe that the Gulf region, an important one to the world's economy, does not have so far any kind of institutionalized forum for dialogue beyond the Cooperation Council. And besides solving the existing conflicts, there is also a need for dialogue to tackle important challenges that face the region collectively, which vary from environmental issues to immigration, terrorism, and to economic diversification. And needless to say, an agreement on those issues can serve as an important building block for a robust trust to address other security issues. And regional institutions alone are not sufficient if they are created only for dialogue. They are effective when all states can use them to develop cultural and also economic relations. And these multiple ties create interests and trust that makes cooperation on security issues easier. Evidently, when there is trade and flow of people between the states and the Arabian Gulf, they can make concessions to one another on issues that are related to their security. So to conclude, we are optimistic, or we want to be optimistic, that, for example, the current dialogue between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the ongoing efforts, for example, in Iraq to bring the regional players to a table, can be cornerstones for a wider dialogue that includes all the states in the region. I will stop here and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Fabian, for that very direct and to the point discussion of the main regional security issues as they pertain to the Gulf. So I'll immediately move on to my colleague, Dr. Christian Alexander, who is Director of the International Security and Terrorism Program here at Trends Research and Advisory. Christian, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. I'd like to kind of offer up a UAE perspective or view on the security environment. So many experts in recent years have used the concept of regional security complex to analyze security and strategic issues in the Gulf and beyond, which obviously helps shed some light on the key security dynamics and challenges. Of course, very often you get regime security and national security conflated, yet they imply different priorities. Changes have taken place in the last 2 decades in the development of a much more integrated Middle East regional security complex. As a result, threat perceptions and security dynamics in the Gulf are today clearly impacted by events taking place in the broader region and vice versa. So if you think of security dynamics in the Levant or the Maghreb, they are now closely intertwined and affecting events taking place in the Gulf. So these different subsystems are interconnected. So again, in this context, regional stability, that of the Middle East and not just simply of the Gulf, has emerged as a top priority for the UAE and has become one of the key strategic objectives in its foreign policy and security policy, with a number of initiatives and important themes that I'm going to be talking about. In this presentation, I'd like to highlight 3 of them in particular. The first one which has emerged as a key component of the country's push for regional stability, is the fight against terrorism and the efforts to confront extremism in all its forms. So, for example, the UAE has been a very key active member of the global coalition against Daesh, co-chairing along with Germany and later with the United States in working groups on stabilization, which obviously has played a crucial role in helping stabilize areas liberated from Daesh and provided key support to UNDP-led stabilization and reconstruction initiatives in Iraq since 2015. So it's moved from being a passive observer maybe 20 years ago to a more of a proactive shaper of its security environment. In 2014, the UAE cabinet also published a list of 83 designated terrorist organizations, including the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and a number of other groups that are present in the West. The UAE has developed a reputation as demonstratively the most proficient military in the Gulf region. The UAE stands out in comparison to other Arab countries for its modern advanced weaponry, such as drones, missile defense systems, and warships. Over the years, UAE forces have taken part in numerous offensive military deployments and exercises in such areas like Bosnia, Afghanistan, and Libya. The country has also allowed its forces to train alongside important NATO counterparts to reach regionally unusual levels of combat efficiency. The UAE has also experienced some participation in several US-led military operations, such as in Somalia, the Balkans, Afghanistan, as well as air operations in Libya in 2011 and against the Islamic State that I mentioned earlier in 2014 and 2015. Another key component or key initiative that in this regard has been the establishment of the Sawab Center, which is part of the US Digital Communications Hub to combat extremist ideologies online and to promote positive alternatives. Promoting tolerance has also been identified as a way to tackle extremist ideologies. The UAE has in this domain shown great leadership and clear desire to lead by example, including through the establishment of Ministry of Tolerance, the construction of Abrahamic worship houses in Abu Dhabi, which obviously will house mosques, synagogues along each other. Obviously, the UAE is promoting the idea of its implementation of a more moderate version of Islam, highlighting the issues of diversity and tolerance as being key components in the battle against extremism. Another element of confronting extremism in all its forms has involved taking a firm stance against political Islam, against Islamist groups whose ideologies oftentimes have inspired terrorist organizations, including that, of course, of the Muslim Brotherhood and those who regionally support them. Another key theme or ingredient for regional stability has been the efforts of the UAE to promote principles and mechanisms required for the establishment of a new, more stable Middle East regional order, meaning there are different principles by which it's abiding by. The first one would be to ensure respect for national sovereignty and an end to interference in the domestic affairs of other countries in the region. Obviously, this has been, the UAE has led repeated calls to countries in the region, particularly Iran, but also others, to stop meddling or threatening to interfere in other countries' internal and domestic affairs. The second would be developing strong regional multilateral institutions and mechanisms and norms that can support the peaceful resolution of disputes between states and encourage countries to resolve any internal conflicts through political dialogue. Obviously, here a prime example of the UAE's engagement is via its preventive diplomacy. If you look at peaceful transitions in Sudan and Eritrea and Ethiopia, that would come to mind. The UAE has also joined most UN organizations and affiliates, as well as regional Arab and Islamic organizations, such as the Organization of the Islamic Conference and the GCC. So again, from an institutional perspective, very important for the UAE to be members of these different entities. The third core principle is related to efforts to build a core of strong, moderate Arab countries that are stable, well-governed, and deliver for their people. So here, what comes to mind is countries like Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. So the notion here is on building more inclusive and accountable, viable states that would somehow, in the long run, tackle the issues of governance and overcome development problems, and then hence become more regionally stable. So this obviously has been supported by the UAE's foreign aid policy, in particular through development assistance, which has become a key component of its efforts to promote economic growth and stability in the region and beyond. Finally, efforts to promote stability in the region and beyond has also been done through the establishing of strategic relationships with extra-regional countries and non-Arab states. In particular, the UAE has developed a solid partnership with the United States and has strongly supported US engagement in the region as a way to further solidify regional stability. I mean, of course, there have been, over the past 2 decades, important moments of doubt over both Washington's willingness and capability to remain in the region as main security provider. But overall, I think the partnership remains very strong today, and the UAE has adjusted to the burden-sharing policy put forward by successive US administrations. At the same time, the UAE has also actively sought to diversify its partnerships with other major powers, particularly those having increasing influence in the Gulf and the Middle East. In recent years, the UAE has rapidly expanded its ties with India and other important partners in Asia, including China, South Korea, Japan, and of course, Russia. The so-called pivot to the East, diversifying its allies, and of course, consolidating its relationship with Israel within the context of a US-Israel UAE alliance. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Christian. I'm moving very swiftly on to our last speaker, joining us from the University of Guadalajara in Mexico, Dr. Jorge Shabat, who is professor of the Department of Pacific Studies. Dr. Shabat, the floor is yours. Thank you. Sorry. Dr. Shabat, I think you're muted. We can't hear you at the moment. Yeah, you're Dr. Shabat.
Yeah. Finally, I solved it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Problem with, yeah. Okay. Okay. Wait a minute. Yes. Where is it? Yeah. Good. Okay, here I am. Good. Finally, thank you. Sorry for all these computer problems. Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. This thanks to Trends Advisory and Research and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Well, it's complicated to talk about what strategies we can develop in the next 50 years. The good thing about that is that in 50 years, probably nobody of us will be here. So we fail our predictions. Nobody will. I mean, will demand us for what we said. No? But well, I'm trying to present a general view of the problems about global security in the next year. Based most of it on the experience I have had many years studying the situation in Mexico and Latin America, especially related to criminal groups and the threats that they pose to stability. So I have named my presentation how to deal with the responsible states. You know, in the 1980s, many people talk about rogue states, and later on they talk about failed states. But I prefer to talk about irresponsible states because in most of the threats are generated by the actions of the states, human actions, and probably we can do something about it. Well, the list of threats to national stability you can find in the academic literature is very abundant. Some of these have been mentioned. They include state and non-state, human and non-human threats, and they go from expansionist powers, wars for territory, natural resources and markets, to pandemics, environmental problems, weapons proliferation, financial crisis, famines, natural disasters, cyber attacks, uncontrolled migrations, terrorism, and transnational crime. And well, facing these threats, the international community, as you may know, has developed some imperfect mechanism to deal with this. The creation of the United Nations and some international regimes that have worked more or less on finance, trade, environment, arms control, and also agreements on police and law enforcement cooperation. The problem is that notwithstanding these agreements, the world is still very vulnerable to terrorist actions, organized crime groups, and the actions developed by dictatorships, criminal states, and basically what I call irresponsible governments. I mean, they are not exactly billions in the traditional sense that governments that want to create problems, but they just don't care. I mean, they are irresponsible, they are sloppy at some point, and we have to deal with that. The strategies for the next decades basically have to deal with this threat posed by dictatorships, criminalized and responsible states, and are not easily managed by the 16 international agreements. The problem is that international cooperation is not enough by itself. It's necessary to make a state accountable. I have been listening the virtues of international cooperation for many years, and from all the time people say, yeah, we have to cooperate. Yeah, sure. That the problem is that these cooperation agreements are made with governments that are causing these problems, the problems that they are trying to solve. The extreme example of that is that when you sign some agreements about fighting drug trafficking, some cases you sign it with authorities that are involved with drug traffickers. No? So well, obviously this is not going to work unless you find some ways to make this state accountable. The international community in this sense has to create mechanisms that can force irresponsible states to be accountable for the threats they are generated, sponsoring terrorist or criminal groups, some not very pro-environment policies. I mean, many people talk about climate change, like if climate change has been provoked by some external actor from outer space or some force of nature. They are created by human actions and by states in many cases. There are also weak controls on pandemics. People talk about pandemics, but there are irresponsible actions of governments in controlling health problems, pandemic, financial crisis. Obviously, the big obstacle we have for that is power. Some states are very powerful powerful enough to resist international pressures. That is the case of some states that violate human rights, cause environmental degradation, or have weak sanitary controls. There are also some states that tolerate criminal groups or are clearly penetrated or accomplices of criminal organizations. The big problem is that international agreements, for instance, are made with governments which do not have the political will to be responsible for the threats they generate. So in that sense, what we can do about it? Well, the challenge for the next decade is to identify the areas of vulnerability. Some of these have been mentioned, the areas of vulnerability of the international system that can generate threats. Most of these threats are directly or indirectly provoked by responsible states. I mean, in some way, these states are causing these problems, not sometimes not in a very dear way, but they are causing these problems. In this sense, I think that we must develop an international accountability system with mechanisms of supervision of the possible threats of what's happening inside the states. Obviously, there is a problem with that, and this is sovereignty. The ideal world of Westphalian world of absolute sovereign state is not possible anymore because some of the problems are provoked by the actions inside the states. And the areas of supervision must include domestic policies in environment, health, finance, law enforcement, and corruption. I think I'm conscious that there will be opposition of the big powers, and I include United States, China, Russia, etc. And the challenge is how to use interdependence to make states accountable. And that's basically what I'm thinking we can develop in the next 50 years. It's not an easy task, but if we assume that the sovereignty is an absolute mandate, that we cannot act and look at what is going inside the states, we're not going to face the threats that are being caused by some of these states. Obviously, it's not an easy task, but the world has been moving toward a system of international agreements, international institutions, and that's probably the only path we can follow if we want to face these challenges that are clearly in our eyes, and they will be worse and worse during the following years. And well, that's it. I think I have not exceeded my 10 minutes, and thanks again for the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shabat. We've unfortunately only a short time for discussion. And bearing that in mind, I was trying to think of something which I'm going to throw this out to all of our speakers. Given what's been happening recently in Afghanistan, of course, that's been on the minds of many people. I keep reflecting on this issue of development, and if we define development in its broadest terms, we could include things like economic aid led by multinational multilateral institutions, improve trade access, technology transfers, including new technologies such as AI, and so on. So the question is basically, which I want to open the floor completely, is, are development and sustainable security two sides of the same coin? Are they mutually dependent? Whoever would like to venture an answer first, please go ahead.
I'm a development anthropologist by training. So, I interact with, I've interacted in the past with a lot of multilateral organizations, the UN system, bilateral aid organizations. And, there's there's not, I mean, when you are looking at it from afar, it seems like, it's either a carrot or a stick, right? That is well known. I mean, this kind of dichotomy between the enticement of aid versus use of force, right? But within that carrot, I mean, there's like, prisms within prisms. Like, what is the right approach for development? Is it structural adjustment? Right? Is it like neoliberalism? Is it all about market access? Who benefits from that? Elite-led growth, the failure of trickle down from the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the kind of, underbelly of globalization that we see today, right? So I think it's important to bear that in mind as well when we think about a term like development.
I'll just add one thing. I know we're right at close, but connectivity and communications are probably the most important thing. If people within the country cannot communicate with each other, I think that is, just one basic need that a lot of technology organizations can provide.
Thank you, Steve. I've just been informed we can extend a discussion if it's agreeable for all of you. We can still talk about another 10 to 15 minutes. If I hate to take up any more of your time than is necessary. So assuming that's everyone has some spare time, we can get through some more questions. But yes, would anyone else? The floor is still open. Anyone else would like to contribute? Please feel free to do so. Yeah, going back to the importance of development. But again, I emphasize it's development in its broadest definition: governance reforms, trade, economic aid. Any further comments?
I mean, I'm happy to come at it from another angle, and it's I mean, it does seem, I mean, of course, in the world that we live, I mean, we haven't seen great success of control economies. I mean, certainly in the USSR and that conventional sense of the state controlling economies. China has been an interesting example, right, where the political control has not been relinquished. And we see other variations of this governance model elsewhere in the world as well. But, I mean, the idea is that, China is open for business. And now it's, particularly the way that the state is controlling sort of, its broader investments, the influence of the state and state-owned companies, is unique and different from the way that sort of Western neoliberalism has gone about it. But again, I mean, we can think of this as this, this way, these two distinct ways of doing business, right? And the jury is still out, and there's a lot of finger pointing on both sides, right? Where the US is, for instance, accused of economic imperialism. I mean, by South America and many other places in the world, and now the U.S. is talking about China in that same way, and China, says that we don't want to interfere, we don't want to tell you what to do. Our business is business when we invest in your country. But and I'm working on this. I'm doing this research right now. I'm looking specifically at China's role in Pakistan, and what that translates into in terms of participatory development, in terms of who's actually controlling that process of development. And on the other hand, then you have NGOs, and the problem with NGOs is that civil society is still quite dependent on the donor community, right? So then there's concerns of like co-option. So how do we kind of get away? I mean, how can we think of mobilization at the massive level that's not chaotic, right? Which is not co-opted by populist elements or more radical elements, right? I mean, these are open-ended challenges, and we can think of them using that development sort of, framework that you'd put forward.
Thank you. One of the,
if you don't
sorry,
mind,
Christian, would you
just
like
very
to?
quick, I mean, just pertaining to what I had mentioned earlier, I think the UAE has been actively contributing and supporting international development programs for many years now. It has regularly exceeded the UN target of 0.7% of its annual gross national income and allocated as development assistance in the range of 1%, which is way above the recommended 0.7%. So I think the UAE clearly has also tried to how the UAE differs from some of the other institutions and countries is that pretty much all of their assistance is with no strings attached. So there are no requirements, no stipulations in terms of how that money has to be used, how it needs to be allocated. So in that sense, I guess you could argue that maybe the UAE is kind of trying to somehow, fill the gap here in that sense.
Okay, moving on to another question. Given, I mean, again, bearing in mind what's happening in Afghanistan, but also on this issue generally of security governments, multilateral cooperation, and given we often see gridlock at the level of the United Nations Security Council, how can the major actors, thinking specifically of the United States, European Union, China, Russia, and perhaps others, how can cooperation between these powers, how could it be made? Are there any prospects for making cooperation between the major powers more effective in dealing with issues such as Afghanistan, and perhaps also in relation to other areas in the Middle East and indeed other regions? So the reform of international security governance perhaps is the issue here.
I'd be so bold to say is, in addition to the telecommunications project, it would be a great opportunity for the world powers to work together to achieve both telecom and unified transportation. And, food, water can all be shared a lot more easily, and perhaps a new alliance can be formed and some advancements can happen.
Anyone else like to contribute?
I don't know, but I think it's desirable to find this cooperation. In theory, it should happen, and it's happening at a certain point in some areas. But these big countries need to become more interdependent in order to find this cooperation more possible. This is happening in some way, but I don't know. I'm still very skeptical in the short run. Probably in the next 50 years, we will see that not only in Afghanistan, but in other areas. But as it has been mentioned, we nowadays we have the competition between China and the United States. It's very real. It's happening. I don't know. I think I wouldn't be very optimistic in the short run. You need to develop more interdependence links. Otherwise, cooperation is not possible, because in the end you have the tension between the benefits of cooperation and the need to find some advantage over and seek power, the world power, from advantage over the other powers. No, so yeah, I don't know. I'm in the short run. I won't be very optimistic, even when we have a very interdependent world and some agreements, and we have obviously a much more cooperative world and more cooperation than we have had in the 50 years ago. But well, I don't know.
So perhaps that's where the gridlock is. That another problem perhaps is that there's too much reliance on the major powers, and perhaps the emphasis should be more on regional security groupings. I'm alluding to what Fabian had to say in his paper. Would you agree that there needs to be more of an emphasis on new regional security structures over the next 50 years? And that's a question for anyone on the panel who'd care to address that.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Sorry. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense from satellite communications, for example. It would be a lot easier for the Gulf states and the Middle Eastern states to have corporate deployments of satellite communications and share that just for that region.
If I just may add maybe one thought on this, because Stephen, your initial question was, are we witnessing a gridlock, especially when it comes to the United Nations? And what about the existing institutions that we have? And with the institutions, I mean institutions where discussions and decisions can be made between major powers, but also between, let's say, normal powers in a very structured way. So let's say, the sense of institutions, that you have a structure that all agreed on, where discussion is possible and decisions can be made, and then there is also accountability. But nevertheless, I think getting it more to a regional level, and also getting it more to the needs when it comes to the region. For example, when I look at the Arabian Gulf, I think we have a need to tackle the environmental challenges, and the environment is also a security issue. And there we can think of, let's say, ad hoc coalitions of also smaller powers who tackle, not in the, let's say, old institutions, these very pressing security issues.
Would anyone else like to add anything?
Well, I think that, I mean, the US is, I mean, if we go back to Afghanistan, it's relinquishing space. I mean, it had intervened, I mean, all the way, to the Soviet invasion onwards. I mean, it's not like, I mean, it was the sense of global responsibility which brought it there, right? I mean, there were reasons to go in there. And that relinquishing of space, I think one mistake that was made was, and there's recognition of that the Bonn process right after 9/11, when the Taliban were, dismantled, they were not included in the political process. So I think even locally there was room for, political negotiation all the way back then, which might have led to very different political contours in Afghanistan right now. And regionally, I think that space is being relinquished and taken up now by China and Russia. And the US might have over the horizon conventional, counterterrorism capabilities, which it will choose to exercise. But we saw, I mean, if you look at Brown University and the $2 trillion plus, I mean, look at how much of that went to development. More than half was, keeping boots on the ground and training the national security capacity of Afghanistan, which, we've seen the outcome of that effort as well. So I think that, while yes, there's potential for regional structures, I mean, to not only for Afghanistan, but other reasons like environmental cooperation via SAARC, for instance, there's this grouping of South Asian countries. But even there are impediments. I mean, the acrimony between India and Pakistan holds like SAARC efforts to hostage, like prevents regional cooperation. But unfortunately, like the global contours and the great power competition is not alleviating, right? Those kinds of, it's in fact worsening those kinds of tensions. And I think so that responsibility, I mean, we need to rethink global sort of, global arenas of cooperation and the overlaps that we can see between national interests, international interests, right, and what's feasible for local actors. Otherwise, we'll see a lot of pushback locally, as you see with some of the BRI projects like disgruntlement. So it's not impossible. It's just that, it can't be imposed from the outside, right? And everyone's interests need to be taken into consideration. So whether that happens through bureaucracies like the UN system, working in collaboration with, that is, I mean, that's the technique of it. But I think that, at the broader level, there needs to be a strategic rethink and a strategic alignment.
Thank you, Dr. Ali. Just, I think, got time for one more brief question before we wrap up. Of course, there's a great deal of interest when we're talking about security is how the development of future technologies and AI will relate to how security challenges, concerns may evolve over the next few decades. I mean, one particular dimension of risk that interests me, and I hope other people, is when do cyber attacks, when do cyber sabotage, if you like, of private companies, of critical infrastructure providers, for example, when does cyber warfare move from the private to the public domain, or should we distinguish between the private and the public domain in the case of cyber warfare? I guess this relates to what Professor Shabbat was saying about irresponsible states. Perhaps another way of phrasing it is, could we see a situation where a cyber attack on a private company could cause a war between countries? And perhaps more generally, is AI new technologies, is it something to be perhaps feared as much as welcomed in terms of how it may impact on security and conflicts in the future? Again, for the whole panel, I'm sure Steve would have it.
Yeah, sure.
I invite everyone to contribute to that.
Well, from a technology standpoint, yeah, it's absolutely a point of fear, because game theory, chaos theory could be advancements to essentially create these cyber attacks more autonomous and allow for anti-ransomware to be defeated. So it's just a question of taking a look at the way that the protections, the cyber protections react, and if there are these greater expert systems in which huge amounts of data based on reactions from these private companies are mined and stored and then replayed, it could be nearly impossible to defeat an AI agent. So that's a real serious problem, and it's actually one thing that the U.S. State Department is taking a look at very, very closely. But for the first part of your question, hey, who are the threats that are state-sponsored? So that's a question. And the U.S. has primarily just identified the advanced persistent threats primarily in both Russia and China, and really hasn't been totally concerned whether they're private or public, but there is great evidence that is country-based. So in the case of our critical infrastructure in the US, this has been targeted all of the last 2 years. And I do not believe that it will create a war because on our end, but it could certainly create a war if factions in Asia begin to conflict.
Thank you. Would anyone like to add to that?
Yes. I think this good question. it's complicated to see if a threat is caused by a totally private actor, or what's the role of the state. But the truth is that in most of the cases, even when the threats are posed by non-state actors, states are involved in some or another way. I mean, this idea that there are purely private actors, non-state actors, that nobody controls them, I don't know. I begin to think that I'm thinking in these cyber attacks, criminal organizations. Even pandemics are created in part by humans, and there are responsible states behind that. What I'm trying to say is that the role of the states is probably more important than the most recent literature about non-state actors have been suggesting. States are still there, maybe not in a very, very clear way, not in a very open way, but most of the threats are caused by states in a direct or indirect way, and we need to think about it, even when obviously there are some private actors involved also, but the responsibility of the state is still there, and we need to think about it for future analysis. And well, that's what I suggest, talking about the responsible states. And I think, well, I will think more about it in the following months. Okay.
Thank you very much. I think I'm afraid we've just about run out of time. I'd like to thank all our panelists very much for their contributions, and also express my gratitude that you're able to stay a little longer than we originally scheduled. But it's been a very interesting discussion, very productive. I'd also like to thank our audience for joining us. Trends, of course, is running this event as part of its ongoing series of online symposia, and I hope everyone can join us again soon. And thank you very much to everyone, and looking forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.